Welcome to the 62nd Theoretical-Physics-Colloquium by Dr. Carolyn Raithel. She's at the Institute for Advanced Study and at Princeton University. She got her PhD from the University of Arizona in 2020, and she was a postdoctoral fellow since then at Princeton Center for Theoretical Science. And she's also a John Bachel Fellow at Institute for Advanced Studies in Princeton. She received a couple of honors already when she was a PhD student. In 2019, she received Dr. Pliny and Margaret Price in cosmology and astroparticle physics from CCAPD at Ohio State University. And in 2020, she received Outstanding Teaching Award at the University of Arizona. She was doing also some professional service between 2017 and 2019. She was a graduate student representative on the Stewart Observatory Committee for Diversity and Inclusivity. She has already a rather wide research interests. It includes neutron stars, equation of state of dense matter, gravitational waves, neutron star mergers, physics of supernovae, and today she will be talking about probing the dense matter equation of state with neutron star mergers. And with that, I'll give the microphone to Carolyn.
Great, thank you, Igor, for the introduction and for the invitation to join you all today. It's great to be able to see this wide range of people from a number of different institutions and to share with you all some of the work that I've been doing on trying to constrain the dense matter equation of state using neutron star mergers. Oops. Okay, so I want to start with a brief overview because I know we have a pretty broad audience here today to motivate some of the open-ended questions in this line of research and some of the main goals of this line of research. So as I'm sure many of you know, neutron stars are formed during the core collapse supernovae that mark the deaths of massive stars. Neutron stars typically have masses between 1 and roughly 2 times the mass of the sun. And they have a characteristic radius of on the order 10 kilometers. And so when you have this much matter compressed to an object that's roughly the size of the island of Manhattan, of course, you're encountering very extreme densities, with the core densities of the innermost region of the neutron star reaching a few times 10 to the 15 grams per cubic centimeters, or equivalently, maybe 6 to 8 times the nuclear saturation density. And so as you descend inwards into the interior of the neutron star, the environment that the matter is in becomes increasingly extreme. So while the outer layer of the neutron star still has some normal nuclei like we're used to seeing that are left over from the progenitor star, as you descend deeper into the neutron star, these nuclei become increasingly neutron rich as the nuclei are compressed closer together, and it becomes energetically favorable for neutrons and protons to combine. At densities of around half the nuclear saturation density, there's a phase transition where essentially the nuclei have become so neutron rich that they can no longer remain bound as nuclei, and instead the matter forms as a uniform sea of neutrons, protons, electrons for chemical balance. Descending even deeper into the core region of the neutron star, our understanding of what happens to the matter becomes less clear, in part because the usual ways that we might think to describe the equation of state, for example, by expanding the particle interactions in terms of few body potentials, starts to break down as the waveforms of individual particles begins to overlap at these very high densities. And so there are a number of different theoretical predictions for what happens to the matter in the inner regions of the neutron star. Some theories predict that the matter remains nuclear to these very high densities, so you'd still just have this sea of neutrons, protons, and electrons. Other theories predict that at these densities, you can get a state that's called deconfined quark matter, in which the boundaries that delineate individual nucleons dissolve, leading to a mixture of free quark matter effectively. And the energies also might be high enough that you can get the emergence of exotic particles like strange quarks, either bound in the form of hyperons or free as deconfined quark matter, or meson condensates are also included in some of these models. And so it's really a big question mark for what happens in the innermost regions of the neutron star, and starting to differentiate between these different predictions is one of the main goals of this line of research. Experimentally, there are a few different ways that we can proceed when it comes to studying the properties of very dense matter. There are terrestrial-based nuclear experiments that are able to study dense matter. And particularly, these are studies, for example, of finite temperature nuclei at low energies, and at higher energies, we of course have the high energy nuclear experiments like from the relativistic heavy ion collider and the LHC. However, on this kind of cartoon phase diagram where I'm plotting temperature as a function of neutron excess, these experiments fall pretty far to the left side of this plot, meaning that they're probing matter with relatively equal numbers of protons and neutrons. Additionally, these current generation of experiments are typically probing matter only up to and around the nuclear saturation density. Whereas I've already said the matter in the cores of neutron stars can reach 6 to 8 times the nuclear saturation density. So neutron stars not only are much more neutron rich than what's probed in these experimental efforts, but also can be several times more dense. And so extrapolating from those experimental results to the conditions of neutron stars introduces a lot of uncertainty into the resulting equation of state. And this is why this kind of remains this big open question. And so moving forward, to understand the equation of state in this particular region of parameter space really requires observations of neutron stars. And today I'm going to focus on the newest, or one of the newer windows that we have into studying the neutron star interior, and that's through the detection of gravitational waves from binary neutron star mergers, which I'll just briefly highlight here before moving on, are particularly interesting because they span this kind of broad region of the parameter space in which the neutron stars, while they're still far away from each other before they merge, are relatively cold objects. The average energy of the particles of a neutron star is much less than their Fermi energy, so they are effectively thermodynamically cold. But at the merger, there's significant shock heating that raises the temperatures of the system to large values. And so neutron star mergers provide this interesting way to probe a wide range of this equation of state parameter space for dense neutron-rich matter. Okay, and so again, just because I know there might be some students in the audience, I want to give a brief kind of overview of what a typical neutron star merger looks like, where the top panel is just showing the gravitational wave signal from a simulation that I've run, and on the bottom panel are snapshots of the density contours from the density distribution of the neutron stars. And so just to orient ourselves to make sure we're all talking in terms of the same language, there are 3 main phases of the actual neutron star merger. The first is the so-called inspiral phase, in which the neutron stars go from being these distant objects that are just slowly orbiting each other. But as they orbit each other, they of course have, as massive objects orbiting one another, they're emitting gravitational radiation, which causes the orbit to decay, and the neutron stars become closer and closer together. As they become closer together, they become increasingly tidally deformed by the gravitational potential of the companion. And ultimately, they will become so close that they merge, which is a very violent and messy merger phase. Depending on the masses of the initial stars, the remnant object might be able to survive for some time as a massive neutron star remnant, in which case, it survives as a massive neutron star remnant, it will be a rapidly rotating, non-axisymmetric as a result of the violence of this merger phase, remnant object that is going to, as it brings down and relaxes to some final equilibrium state, it's going to continue to emit gravitational radiation, which is this post-merger phase of gravitational waves. So these are the 3 main windows or periods during a typical neutron star merger. And this also serves as the outline for my talk today. So in the first part of my talk, I'm going to discuss what we've learned so far from the observed binary neutron star mergers to date, which has so far only had access to the inspiral portion of the waveform. These post-merger gravitational wave frequencies are at much higher frequencies that LIGO is not yet sensitive to for any of the events that we've seen so far. But then in the second and third parts of my talk, I'm going to switch gears and focus in on these post-merger gravitational waves and discuss what new physics we might be able to probe from future observations of this post-merger gravitational radiation. And so to that end, I'll briefly mention what the different neutron star mergers that LIGO has detected to date are. And this is, I think, kind of a fun slide because I just had to update it last night with the detection of a new category of events, which I'll get to in a moment. But first, I'll just comment that the very first binary neutron star merger that was detected by the LIGO-Virgo collaboration was event GW170817, which many of you have probably heard a lot about by now. This was the first event, and it also has still the most informative event from an equation of state perspective, because this event was associated with an electromagnetic counterpart and also had a clear signature of the tidal deformabilities of the neutron stars during the inspiral phase. And that's where all the really rich equation of state information that I'm going to discuss comes from. There's also now been a second binary neutron star merger, event 1904-25, which is very interesting from a stellar evolutionary point of view, but has much weaker constraints on the tidal deformability, so it doesn't add as much to our overall understanding of the equation of state. And until very recently, there was just one other event that potentially had a neutron star as an object, as one of the objects in the merger that LIGO has detected, which was this very interesting event of a 23 solar mass black hole that had a 2.6 solar mass compact object companion. And the nature of this secondary companion has been the subject of much debate, in part because this is kind of right at the threshold where we're not sure if the object could be a neutron star or would have to be a black hole. And so it's been highly debated. But then just yesterday, the LIGO-Virgo collaboration announced the discovery of 2 confirmed neutron star black hole mergers. So we now have kind of a growing zoo of these neutron star mergers to work with. But because of the mass ratio of these most recent 2 events, the neutron star is effectively swallowed whole. And again, no tidal information. So from the equation of state point of view, event 1708-17 still is our most informative event to date. And so qualitatively, to give you a sense of how the tidal deformability connects back to the equation of state, I have a little animation playing here that I'll describe in a moment, but the tidal deformability, just to remind you of any object, is just described as the quadrupolar response of that object to the tidal potential of its binary companion. And so if you imagine that you have a neutron star whose entire stellar structure is uniquely determined by its equation of state, if that equation of state predicts that the pressure at a given density is relatively high, that pressure is going to act to move individual mass elements of the neutron star farther away from the center of gravity of the star, causing the overall mass distribution of the neutron star to be very extended, leading to a large radius neutron star. Now, if this neutron star has a binary companion, those individual mass elements are going to be slightly more susceptible to the gravity of the companion star, and the stars are going to undergo a large degree of tidal deformation. In contrast, if the equation of state predicts that the overall pressure is smaller, the mass distribution is going to remain more centrally compact. So for 2 neutron stars with the same binary separation, they're going to undergo a smaller degree of tidal deformation, which is exactly what's been playing in this animation at the bottom, which hopefully plays okay over Zoom, which is obviously a simplified case, assuming that the equation of state is just a single power law. But the intuition here gives you, is qualitatively correct and gives you some sense of how measuring this tidal deformation is going to tell us about the underlying nuclear physics of the equation of state. So having this tidal deformation in the mass distribution of the neutron stars acts to accelerate the inspiral, as you can see in this nice figure from a recent review paper on tidal deformabilities. And so by measuring the time evolution of the phase during the inspiral of the merger, you can place constraints on this tidal deformability and actually empirically measure it from the gravitational wave signal. These are the constraints that were actually measured from event 1708-17, where on the left you can see the cleaned gravitational wave signal that the LIGO-Virgo team measured. And by performing a parameter estimation on the binary waveform here, the parameter that is actually the most cleanly extracted, that contains the tidal deformability information, is not the individual tidal deformabilities of the 2 component stars, but the effective or binary tidal deformability parameter, which is called lambda tilde, and is defined here. And you can see this is just kind of a mass weighted average of the tidal deformabilities of the 2 individual stars in the system. And so the constraints are shown in the figure on the top here, where to give you a sense of scale, the binary tidal deformability can range from values of up to a few thousand, which is what you would expect for large puffy neutron stars, down to values of 0, which is the theoretical expectation for a black hole. And so already from this one measurement from 1708-17, we can see that the binary tidal deformability is relatively small on this scale, indicating that the neutron star mass distribution must be relatively compact. Additionally, or I should say, rather, this tells us that the neutron star mass distribution must be relatively compact. But when this measurement first came out, it wasn't clear that we were going to be able to say anything more concrete about the underlying neutron star stellar structure based just on this measurement of the binary tidal deformability parameter. And so I think one of the interesting things that has come out of the follow-up analysis to event GW170817 is the discovery of a new semi-universal relationship, which allows us to map from this binary tidal parameter back to properties that describe the neutron stellar structure, and in particular, the neutron star radius. And this takes the form of what is effectively a new one-to-one mapping between this binary tidal deformability parameter and the neutron star radius. Where here, what I'm talking about is the intrinsic neutron star radius of the initial neutron stars. So not the tidally deformed radius, but the intrinsic neutron star radius, which is a prediction of the particular equation of state. And I'm talking about just a single radius here because for this particular analysis, we're limiting our assumption to classes of effectively nuclear equations of state for which across a wide range of masses you expect neutron stars to have similar radii. And we first pointed this out in 2018 in a paper where we analytically derived the origin of this mapping. I'm not going to get into the details of that today, but I just want to point out that that analytic derivation is what's shown here in the purple band, while the different clusters of points are the predictions of different theoretical microscopic equations of state. And you can see that effectively this binary tidal deformability parameter scales almost exactly with radius to the 6th power, is what the mapping ends up being. And this is powerful in part because what it allows us to do is to take the constraints that LIGO has published on this binary tidal deformability parameter and now use this one-to-one mapping to translate from these posteriors directly to constraints on the neutron star radius. And when we do this, we find the following constraints on the neutron star radius, which are shown here in the colorful lines on the left, and which correspond to inferring that the radius is between about 10 and 12 kilometers. And this is, I think, in part a powerful tool because one of the main goals of the neutron star equation of state community for the last decade or so has been to measure the neutron star radius using X-ray observations of neutron stars, typically in low mass X-ray binary systems.
Carolyn?
Yes.
I think we have a question from Ignacio.
Sure.
Yes. Could you go back to the previous slide?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, this one, this one. It seems to me that all the equation of state that you use it to check this universal relation are nucleonic equation of state. So yes, where constituents are protons, neutrons, and in beta equilibrium. Have you tried to see if this universal relation you have is still valid if you include other kind of compositions? For example, if you include hyperons.
So let me say, yes, this is exactly right, that these are all nucleonic equations. Well, H4 nucleonic, is hyperonic, but the others are nucleonic equations of state. And the analytic derivation was assuming an n equals 1 polytrope, which is basically assuming that the equation of state is nucleonic.
So if I understood, you said H4 is include hyperons?
H4 includes hyperons.
Okay, thank you.
But if you do have a strong first order phase transition, for example, to quark matter, this one-to-one mapping does start to break down. And there's a really nice paper by Sophia Hahn that was basically showing that when you include these, that the mapping breaks down or broadens.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so I was just saying that the this mapping, being able to map from these tidal deformability constraints to the neutron star radius is particularly useful in part because one of the main goals of the neutron star equation of state community has been to try to measure the neutron star radius using X-ray observations, typically of neutron stars and accreting low mass X-ray binary systems. And so in this figure in the dashed gray line, I'm showing you a summary set of constraints from an analysis of a dozen of these X-ray neutron star radius measurements. And so now we can do a direct comparison between these two very different types of experiments that are both seeking to measure the neutron star radius. And we actually find what I find a pretty remarkable agreement between these two methods, pointing towards relatively small values of the neutron star radius. And there have been a wide range of different analyses that have attempted to extract radius constraints from GW 170817 using similar analyses to what I was describing here, either analytically or empirically with a wider range of equations of state, which might also address some of the questions that were, the question that was being asked. And these different analysis methods all give slightly different inferences for what the radius of the underlying equation of state should be. But I think they all are consistent in pointing towards relatively small values of the neutron star radius compared to the theoretical bounds that were known a priori. In particular, that the neutron star radius seems to be significantly less than 13 kilometers. I want to briefly highlight that there's also a new type of experiment that is now providing additional radius constraints, and these are coming from NICER, which is an X-ray timing experiment on board the International Space Station, which is also attempting to measure the neutron star radius from X-ray observations of neutron stars, but in an independent method from the data that are shown on the left. And they've now published radius constraints from 2 additional sources. And so this gives us a third handle on trying to pin down the neutron star radius from another independent method. And ultimately, I think that having these independent methods is a really important way to understand the systematic uncertainties between these different experimental methods. And ultimately, it will allow us to infer increasingly stringent constraints on the radius. Now we can also map these different experimental constraints directly back to equation of state space, where I'm no longer using the cartoon picture that I showed you with my animation earlier, but this is doing a complete equation of state inference in a fully Bayesian framework. And this figure is just showing a summary set of what these equations of state constraints look like. So in this figure, the blue and orange bands are constraints from analyses of these low mass X-ray binary radius constraints, whereas the green band on top of these are the equation of state constraints from GW 170817. And so the conclusion is much the same as on the previous slide, that GW 170817 has given us equation of state information that is approximately consistent with what we previously had from these X-ray radius studies. But what I think is really exciting here is that from this single event, the new constraints are already starting to be competitive with the dozen or so previous X-ray observations that we had at the time of the detection. And so moving forward, the prospects I think are very good as LIGO continues to observe more and more of these events and builds up additional statistics on what this tidal deformability parameter is, that these equation of state constraints are going to become increasingly tight. Okay, so that wraps up what I want to say about the previous studies of the equation of state from the inspiral part of the waveform. And now I want to switch gears and discuss this post-merger phase of gravitational waves, which hasn't yet been detected, but may be detectable for a sufficiently nearby source with LIGO at design sensitivity, advanced LIGO at design sensitivity, or if not, then on slightly longer timescales with the next generation of telescopes like Cosmic Explorer or Einstein Telescope. And so one of the main goals of looking at these post-merger gravitational waves is the goal of trying to perform Astro seismology with them, in which by looking at the spectral content of the post-merger gravitational waves, so basically by taking a power spectrum of that gravitational wave signal, we can deduce something about the oscillations acting in this post-merger remnant, which in turn depend on the structure of the remnant and as a result on the equation of state. And there's been a lot of work trying to understand how the spectral content of the post-merger gravitational waves maps back to the equation of state. And the general picture looks a little like this, where you see that there are these dominant spectral peaks, which have been associated with different oscillation modes of the remnant. So for example, this dominant F2 mode is associated with these quadrupolar oscillations of the remnant. And so by doing numerical simulations of neutron star mergers with a wide range of equations of state, different studies have found evidence of universal relations between the locations of these spectral peaks and properties of the underlying equation of state, like the radius of the initial neutron stars. And this should look very analogous to the sort of relationship that I showed you between the tidal deformability and the radius. Where here we're looking at correlations, of course, between the spectral frequencies and the radius. But the philosophy is very much the same, where by measuring these post-merger gravitational waves and identifying the location of this F2 spectral peak, you could map this to constraints on the neutron star radius using these types of relationships, and then compare those constraints to what I showed you in the first part of my talk. One challenge to this problem, though, is what I mentioned at the very beginning of my talk, which is that neutron star mergers actually probe this finite temperature part of the equation of state parameter space at late times in the merger. So when the neutron stars collide with one another, there's significant shock heating that raises the temperatures of the system to some tens of MeV. And as a result, the post-merger phase of the evolution is actually probing the equation of state at finite temperatures, whereas the inspiral is probing the equation of state at effectively 0 temperature. And so if our goal is to use observations of this post-merger phase to constrain the equation of state, and we want to be able to connect those equation of state constraints back to all of the equation of state constraints that I showed you in the previous part of my talk, we need a good model to be able to disentangle the relative role of the finite temperature and cold parts of the equation of state. And more generally, we want to understand to what extent does the finite temperature part of the to what extent does the post-merger phase depend on the cold equation of state, and to what extent does it depend on finite temperature effects, which is going to be the subject of this second part of my talk. And so when it comes to modeling the finite temperature equation of state for use in neutron star merger simulations, there are two main approaches that studies typically have employed. The first approach is typically considered the gold standard, and this is to use a realistic equation of state table, which effectively looks like a 3D table, just calculating pressure as a function of temperature, density, and proton fraction, calculated within a particular nuclear framework or otherwise. This figure is summarizing the cold equation of state properties for some of the most commonly used publicly available equation of state tables. And you can see that there's kind of sparse coverage in this parameter space. Among these publicly available tables, you're somewhat limited in terms of what parts of the parameter space you can explore. In particular, if you look at the small radius part of the parameter space, which we think is actually preferred now based on our studies of GW17-17, where we found the radius is more likely between 10 and 12 kilometers, there are no tabulated equations of state that probe that part of the parameter space. Additionally, each of these equations of state tables typically assume something slightly different in the finite temperature part of the equation of state as well. And so when it comes to comparing these different simulations that are run with these different models, there are a lot of moving parts at once because they differ not only in their radius, but also in their maximum mass and also in their finite temperature part of the equation of state. So to get around some of these limitations, one other approach that is commonly used is to instead do an analytic decomposition of the pressure into a cold and a thermal component. And this is useful because in this breakdown, the cold equation of state pressure can now be modeled in any way that you like. You can use nuclear theory to inform the model, or you can inform the model based on all of the astrophysical constraints that we have on the cold equation of state, or you can just use simple piecewise polytropes that let you step through whatever part of parameter space you're interested in exploring. And then a thermal correction is added on after the fact. The challenge is that the traditional way that this has been employed in neutron star merger simulations, the thermal correction term, it has been modeled off of an ideal fluid-based description of the matter, in which the thermal pressure just races like NT. So for the experts in the audience, this is the basis of the so-called hybrid approach. But of course, the ideal fluid approximation in which your particles are far away from one another and non-interacting completely breaks down in the neutron star interior, where the matter is degenerate and strongly interacting. And in fact, if you calculate the thermal pressure, taking into account the effects of degeneracy, what you find are that at high densities, the thermal pressure basically decreases as some of the available free energy of the system goes into these interactions between the particles. And you get this characteristic dip in the thermal pressure, which can result in the thermal pressure being 3 to 4 orders of magnitude smaller than what you would get with this ideal fluid-based approximation for densities and temperatures of interest for neutron star merger simulations. Okay, so to avoid some of those pitfalls of that simple ideal fluid-based approximation, we have developed a new framework that allows you to calculate the equation of state at arbitrary temperatures and also proton fractions. That was designed to maintain the flexibility and also computational efficiency of that hybrid approach that I described on the previous slide, in which we want our model to be based in such a way that you can add the thermal correction to any cold underlying equation of state, even something as simple as piecewise polytropes. But we now want to improve the thermal treatment to take into account the effects of degeneracy and have a more robust approximation. The complete model also allows for the composition to vary in a semi-consistent way, but I'm not going to get into the details of that part of the model today. I'm just going to focus on this thermal correction term. And so to model the thermal pressure for the degenerate matter, we adopt a Fermi liquid theory approach in which the thermal pressure and energy can just be written down in terms of the level density parameter, which is summarized here. And so if we summarize all of these different dependencies, effectively the thermal pressure and energy in the degenerate regime are functions just of the temperature, density, and the parameter Mstar, which is the relativistic particle effective mass and its derivatives, of course. And so if we knew what the complete density dependence of the particle effective mass was, you could write down this expression completely, add it onto your cold model, and be good to go. However, if you're starting with something like piecewise polytropes or something more agnostic for the cold equation of state, we want to still provide a reasonable approximation, a good approximation of what this effective mass function looks like. And so to that end, we introduced a new 2-parameter approximation of the effective mass that we just call the Mstar approximation, which takes advantage of the asymptotic behavior of the effective mass function, so that at low densities, it approaches just the vacuum rest mass of the particles, and at high densities, the effective mass drops off with this characteristic power law decay that we parameterize with the parameter alpha. And so with just these 2 parameters, which are related to the density at which degeneracy starts to set in, and the power law index of the fall off of this effective mass particle, which is very roughly related to the strength of the interactions within the matter, we're able to now calculate the degenerate thermal pressure. And the result of the complete model is shown on the right here, where the diamonds are showing the predictions of one of those tabulated realistic equations of state. The dashed line shows the predictions of that hybrid or ideal fluid-based approximation. And the solid line is our new model for the thermal pressure, which with these 2 extra parameters, you can see is able to actually recreate the thermal pressure also in this degenerate regime. I should just point out here, this is again, just assuming nuclear models, so just neutrons, protons, and electrons for now, but I can come back to that later if there's interest. And so with this framework now in hand, we can start to explore this question of how the finite temperature part of the equation of state is going to influence the post-merger observables of a binary neutron star merger. And so to do this, we constructed we performed a set of neutron star merger simulations, which are just summarized in this slide. So in all cases, we're looking at equal mass neutron stars, 2 1.4 solar mass neutron stars, which in every case are going to be governed by the same cold equation of state, which we use this nuclear model, ENG. And in every case, they also have identical initial data. So we're starting from the same initial conditions. But to each simulation in the sample that we run, we use a different set of Mstar parameters to extrapolate the matter to finite temperatures in the post-merger phase of the evolution. And these Mstar parameters were chosen to bracket the current range of uncertainty in the finite temperature part of the equation of state that's spanned by those tabulated models that I mentioned earlier. These simulations were performed in full general relativity using the Illinois GRMHD code. And I'll just jump ahead and show you a video that hopefully plays okay over Zoom of what the simulations look like. So on the left here, you're going to see for one set of our simulations, the density of the two neutron stars as they merge. And on the right plot is going to show the thermal pressure relative to the cold pressure, where I've normalized the thermal pressure in this way so that you can see the point at which the thermal pressure is going to start to become thermodynamically important when it starts to become a significant fraction of the cold pressure. As you can see, the stars initially start out cold, and in fact, I'll let this play. They remain quite cold up until the point of merger, at which point there's a significant shock heating. And you can see that at late times, the thermal pressure is a significant fraction of the cold pressure and actually can exceed the cold pressure for certain densities. These simulations are only showing matter that's above 1% of saturation, so this is all really effectively high density matter. I'll play the first few frames again, just so you can see the evolution of that heating that occurs at the merger. So as I said, this is for one set of Mstar parameters, but we can also compare what these snapshots of the thermal pressure look like across for our different choices of Mstar parameters that were explored in this initial parameter study. And I'll highlight a few trends here that I want to draw your eye to. First is that we find that for the larger values of this density transition parameter N naught, which characterizes effectively the onset of degeneracy starting to kind of set in, we find that the outer layers of the neutron star have a higher thermal pressure than for the low values of this density transition parameter. We can also look at the temperature profiles of these remnants, and we find a separate trend, which is that the power law exponent of our Mstar drop-off alpha seems to govern really the inner regions of the temperature profiles, with larger values of alpha leading to higher temperatures reached overall in the remnant, and that these higher temperatures actually extend into the innermost region of the neutron star remnant. And so really this is giving us a first look at how the parameters of the finite temperature part of the equation of state are governing different regimes within the post-merger neutron star remnant. And in particular, we're starting now to be able to disentangle how different parts of this Mstar parameterization are maybe governing the structure of the remnant. Instead of looking at these 2D spatial extents, we can also see how the thermal pressure and temperature vary as a function of the density, which is summarized in this plot. And you can see that the thermal pressure, as I think I mentioned when we were watching the movies, is actually a significant fraction of the cold pressure. At the saturation density, the thermal pressure is still exceeding the cold pressure, and it remains above 10% of the cold pressure at densities up to 2 to 3 times the nuclear saturation density. And we find variations of up to about a factor of 5 in the thermal pressure, depending just on what sets of Mstar parameters that we included in the simulation. And likewise, we find differences of factors of 2 to 3 in the temperature that are reached. And it might seem redundant to look at thermal pressure and temperature separately, but these are giving kind of different intuition to how, I think these parameters give different intuition to what the physical processes of this post-merger phase are going to look like. So for example, the thermal pressure, because it contributes to the overall pressure budget of the remnant, is going to influence the oscillations of the remnant and potentially the redistribution of matter within the remnant if the remnant survives for long enough against collapse to a black hole, whereas the temperatures are going to most directly affect the neutrino emissivities and the subsequent cooling and neutrino radiation of the disk. So finally, we can also look at the gravitational wave signals from these different simulations. And the first thing you'll notice is that the inspiral portion of these gravitational waveforms are identical in all cases. And this is a result of the fact that all of these simulations were performed for identical initial data with an identical cold equation of state. So we only start to see differences in the gravitational wave signal after the merger, when the system has become hot enough that the finite temperature part of the equation of state matters. But we do see differences emerging in the post-merger signal here. In particular with differences in the decaying kind of beat frequencies of this gravitational wave signal, which are intimately related to the oscillations of this post-merger remnant. And so this leads to a sort of tantalizing possibility or question that I want to pose here, that we might be able to someday measure these effective mass parameters by measuring the post-merger gravitational waves from a future, probably pretty nearby neutron star merger system. And this is particularly interesting because these Mstar parameters, which govern the finite temperature part of the equation of state, are not accessible with studies of the inspiral, and they're not accessible with any other studies of cold neutron stars or isolated neutron stars. But this would really be new physics that could be probed by studying the post-merger gravitational signal. I'm leaving it as a question here because this is kind of a preliminary result. This was studied for one particular equation of state, cold equation of state. We'll be extending this to additional equations of state in the coming months, and additionally trying to further quantify how significant these differences are. So I'll leave it as a question for now, but this is potentially an exciting prospect moving forward for being able to probe new physics. Okay, so now in the last few minutes of my talk, I'm going to switch gears again. Whereas in the last section of this talk, I had been discussing an application of this Mstar framework in which we had the same cold equation of state, but we're exploring differences in the finite temperature part of the equation of state. Now I want to switch gears and instead discuss how the Mstar framework can be used to study differences in the cold part of the equation of state parameter space, but now using the Mstar framework to ensure that the finite temperature part of the equation of state is going to be the same in all models that we consider, so that we can really isolate the differences in the cold equation of state. So the particular cold equation of state property or quantity that I want to consider in these last few minutes is a parameter called the nuclear symmetry energy, which is just defined as the difference in energy between symmetric nuclear matter, which has equal numbers of protons and neutrons, and pure neutron matter, which is less energetically favorable. So the difference between these two compositions is how the nuclear symmetry energy is defined. And the nuclear symmetry energy is often represented as a simple series expansion in the density, shown down here, with leading order coefficients S, which just describes the value at the nuclear saturation density, and L, which is the leading order slope or density dependence of the saturation of the symmetry energy. And there have been many experimental and theoretical constraints to date that have placed these broad correlated constraints on S and L, including constraints from astrophysical observations of neutron stars. It might not surprise you to know to learn that the neutron star structure is also sensitive to the nuclear symmetry energy, in particular the slope of the nuclear symmetry energy, as neutron stars contain very neutron-rich matter, and most of the matter is at densities near and above the nuclear saturation density. In particular, I want to highlight here just that these astrophysical constraints are pointing towards kind of relatively small values of the slope of the symmetry energy here between maybe 40 and 60 MeV, depending on the particular data that are included. Recently, there has been some excitement in this field with the announcement of a new measurement of the slope of the nuclear symmetry energy from the PRex experiment, which is an experiment that is aiming to measure the neutron skin thickness of lead-208. And based on the newest results from this experiment, which were announced earlier this year, the resulting constraints on the nuclear symmetry energy slope, L, are that it is 106 plus or minus 37 MeV, which places this at a much higher value than the current astrophysical constraints have been suggesting. So with quite broad error bars. So the tension here is still only very mild, but this has sparked a lot of recent discussion and excitement in the community trying to reconcile these different observations. And so Just in the last few minutes of my talk, I want to discuss a project that I've recently been working on with Elias Most, who's a postdoc here at the IAS and Princeton as well, where we try to answer the question of whether we can use post-merger gravitational waves to probe the nuclear symmetry energy, and thus perhaps give some new insight into what these values are. And so to this end, we constructed a new sample of 9 different equations of state that were constructed to systematically vary in the slope of the nuclear symmetry energy, ranging from values of 40 to 120 MeV to try and span this huge range of uncertainties. Where at higher densities, we just switched to piecewise polytropes in our pressure, so that we can ensure that we are fixing different macroscopic properties of the neutron stars. And this is really important because, as I showed you on this Astro seismology slide earlier, the post-merger gravitational waves are already known to be quite sensitive to the radius, or in some cases tidal deformability of the initial neutron stars. So we want to, as much as we can, do a controlled experiment where we're keeping these macroscopic properties fixed, while still systematically varying the slope of the symmetry energy. Crucially, we keep the finite temperature part of the equation of state to be identical for all of the new models we're constructing using the Mstar framework, with an intermediate set of parameters that was informed by the simulations I showed you in the last part of my talk. These are details on the simulations, but we are again simulating binary neutron star mergers this time with GW17 and like parameters that determine the mass ratio and total mass of the system. And these simulations are again performed in full general relativity using slightly different numerical code than the previous simulations. Okay, and so these are the results for one set of our equations of state that we considered. We're here, what we're looking at are the radii, the equations of state that all have the same characteristic radius of a 1.4 solar mass neutron star, but differ significantly in the value of the slope of the symmetry energy. And we already start to see some interesting differences emerge. So in these plots, the red colors are showing the temperature of the remnant, and the green lines are showing density contours. And so you see right away that for larger values of the slope of the symmetry energy, the remnants reach much higher temperatures compared to having a smaller slope of the symmetry energy. And these are again with fixed, the identical thermal components, so the finite temperature part of the equation of state. And so this is telling us about how the shock heating of the collision, which is where these temperatures are excited, how this propagates as a function of basically of the density dependence of the equation of state near saturation density. The other interesting feature here to notice is that for the L of 40 equation of state, we see that the post-merger remnant is much more symmetric than for these higher values of the slope of the symmetry energy, which we also see in the gravitational wave content. But for this particular equation of state, we basically see that this this remnant becomes symmetric on very quick time scales. And I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to just jump ahead and show the gravitational wave signals that we extract from these different simulations. And then I'll try to wrap up in another slide or so. So these are the gravitational wave signals for all of the equations of state that we studied, where in this figure, the different columns are showing the different comparison cases where we have a particular macroscopic quantity fixed. So the left column, these have a similar characteristic radius of around 11 kilometers, but these were actually constructed to have an identical tidal deformability in every case. The middle and right columns have identical radii of either 12 or 13 kilometers, and the different colors are showing different values for the slope of the symmetry energy. And so you can see here that we find significant differences in some of these cases in the post-merger gravitational waves for neutron stars that are constructed with the same characteristic radius initially, but have very different slopes of the symmetry energy. And we can see these differences a bit more clearly now by actually computing the power spectrum, so effectively taking a Fourier transform of just the post-merger part of the signal here. And these are the summary plots showing the results. And so right away, you'll notice that for this middle panel, where the neutron stars all have the same characteristic radius of 12 kilometers, we find significant shifts in the alignment of these post-merger spectra depending on the value of L, with the location of this dominant spectral peak differing by up to 500 Hertz, depending on L, varying from 40 to 120 MeV. However, this trend doesn't seem to persist for the other equations of state in our sample. We don't see the same trend, or only a much weaker trend for the larger initial stars. And for this other comparison case with the more compact stars that have the same tidal deformabilities, the post-merger gravitational waves are actually indistinguishable with current detector sensitivity. And so this is kind of a perplexing result. We see this clear trend with L for a subset of our equations of state, but it doesn't persist for all of the different equations of state in our sample. And so this suggests that perhaps the real dependence of the alignment of these post-merger spectra is on some hidden parameter that correlates both with the slope of the symmetry energy and with this characteristic radius that would allow us to explain all of these results together. In the interest of time, so we have time for questions, I'm not going to get into this today, but we go through a few different possibilities in our paper. We also discuss the objective properties, but I'll just go ahead and wrap up so that we can have some questions. I want to just emphasize as my kind of main takeaway message that I think the future of equation of state constraints from gravitational wave detections is very exciting as LIGO continues to observe more inspirals and gets more constraints on the tidal deformability. The cold equation of state constraints are only going to continue to improve. And I think there's a wealth of new information that we are going to be able to also extract from these post-merger gravitational waves when those start to become detectable in the coming years. But understanding those requires detailed simulations, numerical simulations using a broad range of equations of state. And so this Mstar framework that I introduced today provides one way of calculating new equations of state that allow you to probe a broad range of the parameter space. And we've found that the finite temperature part of the equation of state can actually affect the remnant structure and also these post-merger oscillations, which provides a somewhat exciting new probe of the finite temperature part of the equation of state. But this framework can also be used to systematically explore differences in the cold part of the equation of state while keeping the thermal physics constant between your models. And I showed you some initial results from a study on the nuclear symmetry energy and how this affects gravitational waves, which is going to be written up in a paper and submitted hopefully within the next 2 weeks or so. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. And thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much for a nice presentation. Now we will have some time for questions. So let's start with the first question by Sanjay Reddy.
Hi, Carolyn. Thanks for a nice talk. I appreciate the need for a minimalist parametrization of the finite temperature effects. And I think you made a nice case for it. What I worry about are regions of density, especially at subnuclear density, where the Mstar parameterization may not be adequate. Just simple things like nuclei dissolving to make nucleons. That has a very characteristic temperature dependence between 1 and 5 MeV.
Yes.
Are these? Do you think that those are important to resolve in these simulations, or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so this is a really good point. So for implementing the Mstar framework numerically at low densities, we switched to an ideal fluid-based approximation. And actually, all that kind of matters is the relative difference between the pressure and energy, which is less sensitive to those details. For the symmetry energy part of my talk, though, the way we got around this was by constructing tabulated equations of state, where at low densities, we just stitched to a known tabulated equation of state that takes into account the formation of nuclei. And this is, like you said, going to be important, especially for determining the low density physics. So it might be more relevant, for example, in determining the ejective properties. And so for really detailed studies of the ejective properties, yes, one workaround is to instead stitch this Mstar parametrization, which really is best for describing the high density matter, to a tabulated equation of state at low densities, which is, I didn't mention exactly what we did in that last study. So that's
okay, thanks. So
idea.
that clarifies it. So at low densities, you're actually accounting for this more complex physics that can be characterized by Mstar.
Yes, yes, that was really just for characterizing the high density physics, which is going to be mostly what's responsible for the dynamics of the post-merger phase.
Okay.
Thanks for the question.
Okay, next question from Mark Alford.
Hi, yeah, I wanted to know how you determine the temperature of the matter in the merger, and as well as the equation of state depending on pressure depending on the temperature. Does the temperature depend on the equation of state?
So this comes from the basis of this Mstar framework, which is based on this Fermi liquid theory approach. And so the thermal pressure in Fermi liquid theory just scales like density times temperature squared. And so when I was showing the temperatures extracted, it was extracted according to this model. So in the numerical simulation, the evolved quantity is related to the energy. So the energy is evolved after solving Einstein's equations. And from this, then from this and the density, which is also an evolved quantity, we're able to extract out what the temperature is according to this model. Does that answer the question? So it's just using this framework.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Actually, I have a sort of extension of this question, perhaps if you're already here. Do I understand it right, that physics-wise, essentially the equation of state at these high densities will be dominated by neutrons. So Mstar, I could think of as a medium modified mass of the neutron. Is that how you roughly at least see it?
Yeah, yes, I think that's exactly right.
And then the rapid drop of the mass is essentially a signature of something like deconfinement or onset of deconfinement. Is that also a reasonable interpretation of this model?
Deconfinement of the neutrons to quark matter? That's not.
Well, basically transition to quark matter. That's what I mean.
No, that's not represented here. This is just due to the basically like the isospin interactions of the matter at these higher densities.
But then how come the neutron mass will be dropping something by orders of magnitude? So let's say from 900 something down to, I don't know, tens or 100 maybe. That seems like a dramatic drop of the mass.
So these are, this is the relativistic effective mass. And these are from relativistic mean field calculations. These are the diamonds, the symbols shown here in terms of the scale, I guess, where it goes down to only tens of MeV. This is at more than 10 times the nuclear saturation density. So those are quite extreme densities where maybe this framework is not valid at, in excess of 10 times the nuclear saturation density. Perhaps that's the answer here. But in terms of the actual scale of these values, yeah, I can point you to the models that computed these if you're interested.
But in your simulation or in those models that you are using for modeling mergers, how far on this scale of the densities do you go up then?
So we reach densities of up to around 3 times the nuclear saturation density, which is around up here still.
So that's where the mass drops by how much then?
I guess by a factor of around 2 or so.
I see. Okay. Any other questions? There is a question from Ignacio Bombaci. Go ahead.
Yeah, I have a question still on the Mstar, the effective mass. So if I understand that Mstar is the effective mass of neutrons, it is right?
Yes, so we consider we use the symmetric matter effective mass, the difference here between the pure neutron and symmetric
so this
matter.
is almost pure neutron matter, because the nucleon in general, nucleon effective mass will depend on the neutron-proton asymmetry. If you have,
yes,
let's say, the mass of the nucleons, if you change the ratio between neutrons and protons, depends also on this beta parameter, the neutron-proton asymmetry, and also the effective mass will depend on the temperature. So it's a very strong assumption what you do to decouple the part of the zero temperature equation of state and the thermal part using just a value for the adiabatic index. In fact, microscopic calculation of the equation of state of asymmetric nuclear matter at finite temperatures have been done. We have done recently a calculation with my collaborators, Domenico Locodeta and Albino Perego, and we show that this approximation is not, let's say, very accurate. This is just a comment.
Yeah, thank you for the comment. This is, of course, exactly right. We are neglecting the asymmetry contribution to the effective mass and also the temperature contribution to the effective mass in this approximation. Mm-hmm. What we showed in our 2019 paper is that even still, this allows us for the densities and temperatures of a neutron star merger to get a reasonably accurate approximation of the thermal pressure to within 20 to 30% accuracy compared to the full calculation. There are, thank you for pointing this out, I should point this out in my talk as well, there are of course more sophisticated models of the effective mass that can be used, but these require many additional parameters that aren't computationally possible to explore in modern merger simulations. Yeah. And so this is a very minimalistic approach to try to understand, at least at leading order, what the relative effects are, so that then we can do more targeted, modeling later with hopefully with more sophisticated models like what you're working on.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer.
Okay,
thank you.
Next question from Sophia Han.
Hi, Carolyn. Thank you for this really nice talk. I have just one simple question regarding the last part of your talk. When you examine the correlation between L and post-merger gravitational wave signals. So I'm curious, is it possible to also look into like the high mass radii and see if there is some trend kind of, because it seems there is a change in high mass R yes. when you vary both L and, when you vary L with a fixed value of radius.
Exactly. So when you fix the radius and vary L, what Sophia is getting at is that this effectively acts to change the slope of this mass radius curve. Yeah. So the high mass neutron stars have very different radii. And we do find, we actually discussed this in the paper, I skipped over it to get to the questions today, but this is exactly right. We do find that some of the scatter in this relationship between the spectral peaks is reduced if you, instead of comparing to the kind of canonical 1.4 mass radius, if you look instead at R 1.8, we do find that is a lot better. And in particular, we also find that the pressure at 3 times the
at higher density. Yes.
Yeah.
At 3 times. Okay.
It's exactly probing this high density equation of state. Exactly. Governing the
right, because L is basically just the outer core region, and post-merger remnant is mostly very compact, occurring high densities, and that's right. I think it's intuitive. Yeah, thank you so much for your answer.
Great, thanks for the question.
Okay, any other questions from the audience? I don't see any raised hands yet. Let me use this opportunity to ask another question. When you were discussing the pre-merger, the effect of the tidal deformability seemed relatively clear physics-wise. You have more deformability, you emit faster, you inspiral quicker, the frequency increases. Seems simple. Now, I don't have that clarity about the effect of L, the symmetry energy. You were making a claim that increasing that asymmetry energy will increase the temperature in the merger. Is there any clear physical reasoning why that happens?
No, this is something we're still looking into and trying to understand exactly why this occurs. What this is telling us is that for neutron stars with basically the same initial compactness, which thus are colliding with similar energy, so they're should be similar amounts of total heating present. But what this is telling us is that this low density part of the equation of state is governing how much shock heating there is somehow. And I don't have a very summary way to explain this. We're still trying to, I think, exactly quantify exactly what is causing that. But
now there is another sort of follow-up of this. I noticed that you were making this claim specifically about radius 12 kilometers, which was that perplexing special case, which is probably not the case for the other radii. So is this statement still valid for the other radii?
So we see less extreme differences for the other radii. So again, this is which don't have this really extreme crisscrossing behavior in the mass radius curve. So as Sophia was pointing out, that for some parts of the parameter space, when you fix the radius in very L, you get these differences in behavior. So yes, some of these effects may be degenerate with basically the slope of the mass radius curve.
Because there is kind of like a sense that you are probably having correlation between the temperature and something else, not the L. That's
yeah.
It seemed to suggest.
I think this set of equations of state that we generated to do this are more extreme than really have been previously studied when we're looking at these really extreme differences in the mass radius curve. And so disentangling, yeah, what's going on here is ongoing work that we're gonna be continuing with as we finish writing up this paper.
Okay. Well, there is another question from Matthias Hanauska. Go ahead.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I have exactly to this picture question. Did you also look at the non-equatorial profile of the temperature? Because usually one gets a donut ring-like structure. Did you also look into this?
I don't think we have.
On the XZ plane.
Looking at the other plane.
Yeah, it would just be interesting to see how, for example, in the middle, how wide this temperature hotspot is moving in the Z direction. Another question in respect to this middle and right picture, where one get these unsymmetric situations with the high temperature hotspots. So these high temperature hotspots are strongly related to the differential rotation profile maxima. And this is, this one can then see also in the gravitational wave F2 peak. Could you please show me again the different frequencies? Yeah, so this would mean that the more compact object, which is the blue one, rotates much faster. And could you go back to the temperature profile then? This you can also see here, and due to the high differential rotation in the high L hypermassive neutron star, you get also these high temperatures there. I think so. This is the reason. Another thing, did you look at the gravitational wave 1-2 mode?
Yes, we do.
And tell me, one sees for the left one, I think more or less nothing, and on the right one you see a
yeah,
1-2 mode.
We do discuss this more in the paper. I don't have the figure handy, but we do see that the 1-2 mode saturates for these large L cases and decays much more quickly for the L40 case. And thank you also for the comments on the differential rotation profiles. This is something that
oh really? Oh, very good. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we have another question from Sophia Han. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just following up the previous discussion on constraining L. from this particular simulation, is it possible to do low mass particular simulation? Is it possible to do low mass merger, which probe basically largely part of the low density part of the EOS?
Yeah,
like 1.2, 1.2 mass merger.
That's an interesting suggestion. So when we started this study, we just took GW17 weight like
for sure,
parameters, but that would absolutely be very interesting to study in a follow-up.
Thanks.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, so I would like to use this opportunity to thank Carolyn again for a very nice presentation, staying and answering all the questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much.